Okay, guys, what we're going to do today is introduce you to texture mapping, which is very important with 3D modeling. So this is Intro to 3D Modeling, Part 3. And our goal today is to create what I would call a super sort of optimized, low-res tree, pine tree, that you could use if you were to do a video game at a lower level of detail or something more stylized. But this is a basic foundational functional idea in regards to 3D modeling and texturing. So let's get it going. But I wanted to show you, we talked the other day about using two-dimensional textures to apply them to three-dimensional objects. So today, again, is an introduction to that, and I'm in Photopea, and I'm here to show you the two-dimensional pine tree texture that we want to take into Vectory and apply to a triangle. And to do that, we're not going to apply it to a rectangle, which is what you see here. We're actually going to create a triangle to keep it as low poly as possible to map this sort of triangular looking tree. So what it's going to look like is, let's say I get my polygonal lasso tool. We're going to create a polygon that's basically a triangle. I'd take it way out here, that outlines and stays outside of these pixels that represent the tree. So we want a triangle that looks like something like that, and then we're going to planar map. So we're going to sort of project this texture map onto that polygon, and then we're going to duplicate it a bunch of times and rotate it, and it's going to look like a super low poly tree. Also keep in mind, I'm going to select all and copy, that we're going to apply a transparency map to that same polygon, and that transparency map looks like this. So I'm going to bring in that pine tree that we saw over here, just so you can see right on top of it we have this transparency map that's in black and white. And as that reads into Vectory, everything that's black is going to be transparent, everything that is white is going to be viewable or opaque, and we'll show you that as soon as we get done with applying these maps. The other thing we have to understand is UV mapping. So UV mapping is applying, we've talked about it before, applying a two-dimensional texture to a three-dimensional mesh or three-dimensional object. So that's what we're going to do with this pine tree. Now if we go into Vectory again, to start we're going to create a triangle. To do that, if I go into my object mode and I go into my primitives, I'm going to scrub down and look, and I go, oh, there's no triangle creation button. That's too bad. Well, as I showed you yesterday, a square or a rectangle is made up of two triangles. So we're going to actually create a square plane. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. And we're going to cut it in half from corner to corner to create a triangle. Then we're going to delete one of the other triangular faces to leave us just with one triangle. There are a couple of different ways of doing this. In fact, I'm going to splice this whole video in with another video I used last year where I did this in a different way, but I thought this would be easier for you this year. Let me expand my little, trying to expand my recording a little bit. That'll work. Oh, there's the bell. Sorry about that. And one thing you have to understand with Vectory is it's sort of weird when it creates primitives. As you can see over here in my transformations, and in Maya, this is called an attribute editor. It shows you a bunch of attributes that are applied to whatever object you have selected. Remember, this is all of your objects list. This is things that are on each object that you have selected. It shows I have a segment of 2. Now, this is something we haven't talked about, and this is rendering style. So there are 4 different rendering styles when I have an object selected. The first one is called textured, and in this case, our texture is just a gray material. We also have shaded, which in Maya is called wireframe on shaded, so that we can actually see the wireframe and the textured data at the same time. We also have wired mode, which just shows us a wireframe, which makes our faces see-through. And then we have bounding box, which is absolutely useless. So The hotkey for that is Z, and I started using that all the time as I got into Vectory a little more. So if I hit Z once, it goes to wireframe on shaded mode. That's what I'm going to call it. I'm going to move this guy up a little bit so you can actually see it. If I hit Z again, it goes to wireframe mode. You can barely see it. It's actually in yellow when we have it selected. If I unselect it, it goes to black. And I'm going to hit Z again, and that goes to bounding box mode, which is, again, useless to me. So I'm going to go back to shaded mode, and then Z again to go to, what do they call it? Shaded mode, which, again, to me is called wireframe on shaded. And I'm going to look at this square and go, why do I have 4 squares to create 1 square? That seems like an awful waste of geometry. And this is the only software I know that does that. Most times if you say, hey, create a plane, it creates a plane that has only 4 verts and 4 edges. This one has more than that. So we can find that over here in square plane where it says segments. I'm going to drop that down to 1 and hit enter. And now I have a true plane that doesn't have anything broken down inside of it. It's all just very as simple as possible. So what do we do now? Well, in order to cut this in half, you can see that if I go to edit, and I'm going to bake it, that's fine, because I'm done playing with it. If I go to edit and select vert mode, and I select my vert and I hit backspace, it gets rid of my whole face and leaves me with an angle. Well, that's not what we want. I can tell you in Maya that that would actually work. It would get rid of half of this object, and I would still have 3 verts and a face. So I'm going to undo that. And instead, we actually have to cut this face in half. So I'm going to go to edit, and I'm going to get my cut tool, hotkey C, and I'm going to make sure that my snapping is snap to end, and my first click will be on one corner. I'm going to go all the way across the other corner, click it again, and hit enter, and that just cut it in half. I'm going to go to face, grab a face, hit delete, and now I have a triangle. Okay, so I want to keep this sort of in line with the world axis. And again, we have front, right, and left. So what I have to do is go back to object mode, and now I'm going to rotate it in, it looks like Z. And if I hold down shift as I rotate, it'll snap to 15-degree increments. So you can see that it snaps, again, when I hold down shift into 15-degree increments. Now I'm going to go back over to Photopea, and I'm going to look at my, I don't want to rename it, at my pine tree. And now I know that I have to, this doesn't look like that triangle that we need at all. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to go to edit mode, vert mode, and I'm going to grab that vert, and I'll move it straight up until it looks like what I think will work. Okay, so now we have a triangle that is definitely doable. I'm going to go back to object mode, and I'm going to snap to grid, and I'm going to bring this back down so it's planar. It's coplanar with the grid. There's no gap. Remember, I raised it up to show you some of the edges that were inside of that rectangle. If I grab that pivot, it should snap. There we go. Snap to grid. So now it's coplanar with that grid. And now what we have to do is map the current material, the default material, to the triangle. And to do that in Vectory, we actually have to go to UV projections under this helpers group here. So I'm going to go to UV projection, and then I'm going to go to my color. First of all, I want to get the tree on there so I can see how I need to manipulate my my projection type, which in this case we want to change to a plane. And now I'm going to go get that texture by clicking on the arrow, upload on. Hopefully it'll take me to my downloads. There's the pine tree, and you should see the pine tree come on, a little bit messed up. We'll fix that in a bit. And to fix it, we have to select our make sure our UV projection is selected and go to edit. Now this gets a little bit tricky in and of itself. You'll see that we have our little gizmo with manipulators, and if I grab the rotate tool, you'll see my texture actually rotating on top of the triangle. There are no numbers, there's no attribute editor over here so that I could rotate that perfectly. So I'm just going to get it to look close. And again, if you want to sort of rotate until it snaps into orthographic view to get it a little bit more perfect, that's fine. We can grab the arrow and move it up. It looks a little crooked to me. I'm going to rotate a little bit more this way. I'm going to rotate around it to get the 3D perspective, scale it so that it fits a little bit. I'm going to scale it from the side so that we don't have any branches cut off. So it's just a matter of going back and forth and moving it, scaling it, rotating it so that it fits in the triangle decently. That'll work for now for what we want. So now I'm going to go back to object mode, and I'm going to map that. I'm going to map my opacity. So I click on this little caret here, go to upload own, go to transparency map, double click, and you'll see that the edges become transparent. The other thing in Vectory is when I'm rotating around, this material has, no, don't do that to me now. This material has sort of a sheen to it. You'll see like light bouncing off of it. It's a little bit reflective. To change that so it's not reflective, I'm going to go to my roughness and I'm going to bump it all the way up. If you go to the right of any number to these little up and down arrows, you'll see your cursor changes. You can left click on it and drag up and down to change that value. Okay, so now that little sheen is gone and we have more of a matte material on our triangle. So the next thing we want to do is we want to rotate this thing up so that our trunk is at the very base of the grid before we start duplicating it. And to do that is a little bit tricky. You can see that our gizmo has this little circle in the middle. That is the actual pivot point inside of our manipulator. That's the point in which things are scaled and rotated and so on and so forth. We need to move that pivot point to the base of our tree. And to do that, you hover over that little circle and you right click. And I can just move it down to the middle point and let it go, and it'll stay there. Now we need to rotate this upright so that it stands above the ground, so to speak. And the problem is look how our gizmo has changed. There's no axis for me to rotate it perfectly up in the direction I want to go. So we actually have to go and change our gizmo's rotation to global instead of local. So if I go to global, you'll see the manipulator change. Now I can rotate it in the axis that I want. So I'm going to rotate it upright, and you can see that rotation number in X changes. And I know I want it to be 90 degrees, so I just punch in 90. And now we have it perfectly upright. Now we have our UV projection and an object, and we want to lock that texture into the object. So to do that, all we have to do is go over to convert to geometry, and it'll get rid of that UV projection and just give us our baked object in order to be able to duplicate it. So let's go to as you can see, by the way, when I did that, it changed the gizmo back, the center back to the middle of the triangle. So I'm going to, before I start duplicating, I'm going to move that thing down to the middle of our grid. Okay, now all we have to do is select our object, Control D to duplicate. And again, I want to go to global rotation. And I'm going to grab this little blue rotation gizmo and rotate it a little bit. And you can see that it's rotating in the Z-axis now. Excuse me. And interestingly enough, for some reason, when I rotate it 90 degrees, it says it's only 45 degrees. That's fine for now. I'm going to click that, change it to 45 degrees to make it perfect. And then I'm going to duplicate it again. Control D, global rotation, and I'm going to rotate it by hand so that it goes from corner to corner. Then I'm going to go back to my original one, select that, the original baked object, duplicate that again, Control D, and I'm going to go to global rotation, and again, rotate it so it goes basically from corner to corner. It doesn't have to be perfect. We just want some three-dimensionality. And there you have it. If you want to group your object, again, shift select all of them. Control G will group it into one object. You can move it and manipulate it that way. But understand that Vectri has a hard time with what's called sorting. So you can see when I rotate, you'll see this white come back. Even though we know it's transparent because we map the transparency to it, you'll see that it has a hard time sorting out which face to draw in front of the other face, okay? That's sort of a little bug. I think it has more to do with web processing power than anything. It sort of works, sort of doesn't, but we have sorting issues here. There's not much we can do about it as we're manipulating inside of Vectri. I can tell you though, if you want to do a quick render just to see what it looks like, you go up to this little circle up here, leave all the settings to where they are and click Start Preview, and it'll go to like a 2D based render, very low res, watermarks all over the place because we're not paying for the software, but you can see that that white sorting issue goes away. And to get out of that, you just click Stop Preview. And that's it until Thursday where we do the Rubik's Cube. Make sure you take a screenshot of your tree and submit it to Google Classroom.